Hi, this is Esoteric Synthesis with Sebastian Wing, and today I'm going to show you how to make a gritty, aggressive patch called a polybass or a crucible bass by processing a lead and a bass together. Both of these names are pretty descriptive. It's a bass that plays multiple notes at once, thus a polybass, and it's also a technique which melts two things together to create something new, like a crucible. This kind of sound design has been made popular by Fox Stevenson in tracks like Go Like, Miss You, and Ether, and I think you'll recognize the sound of it if you're familiar with any of those. If you're ready, let's begin. To create a polybass, we'll need to make a lead and a bass in two different synth patches. Since we'll be routing audio in nonlinear ways, and I work in FL Studio, it makes sense to use Patcher to hold both in one channel. I'm going to use Vital, because that's what I'm familiar with, but you can use whatever you'd like. All of the magic will be happening outside in how we process the two of them. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to keep the lead just a regular default saw wave, and for the bass, I'm going to use a simple sine wave with just a little bit of distortion on it. We'll come back and improve these patches later. Since I need to send different MIDI notes to the lead and to the bass, I'm going to use the VFX Color Mapper, a patcher utility which allows me to use the piano roll's different note colors to create different MIDI channels, which I can then separate inside Patcher and route independently. Each of these four outputs responds to four different note colors you can see in the top left. This is voice output 4, 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to use voice output 1 to control the lead, and voice output 2 to control the bass. And now as we can see as I come into the piano roll, I've got note color 1 selected in the top left here, and I get notes going to the lead. If I select note color 2, I get my sine wave, which means the MIDI is being sent to the bass. Sometimes I really enjoy being able to play both the lead and the bass at once using a keyboard split. I find that I come up with more interesting melodies when I play as opposed to penciling things in, so I'm going to set that up too. Fortunately, there's a second patcher utility, VFX Keyboard Splitter, which will do the job perfectly. I'm going to use note color 3, route that to the keyboard splitter, go into the keyboard splitter, and set up a split. I have a preset already selected for my favorite split, which routes zone 1 is everything above A4, and zone 2 is everything below A4, so I can play the bass with my left hand and the lead with my right hand. Returning to Patcher, I'll select Outputs, Events, Zone 2 to activate the second zone, and now I can send Zone 1 to the lead and Zone 2 to the bass. Now, if I go into the piano roll and I select note color 3, I can play both at the same time. When I do this, I tend to find that the bass is a little bit too high, and so I often will go into the bass patch and shift it down an octave so that when I'm near the keyboard split, the notes kind of make sense for the sort of things that I'd like to play. Now that that's set up, I'm just going to quickly throw down a melody and a bass line so we've got something to work with. That sounds fine to me, so now we can get to the fun part. The first step to making a polybass is loading your favorite distortion and throwing both the lead and the bass into it. Now we have this. Now this doesn't sound great out of the box, and that's because the bass is too loud relative to the lead as they push into the distortion. So if I come into the bass, I just turn it down a little bit. Sounds about right. If it's too loud, you're going to get this choked sound, where you can barely hear the lead. If it's too quiet, you don't have any texture. Right around here is the sweet spot. Once the texture sounds good to you, if the bass still seems kind of too quiet, you could load up an EQ after the distortion to push it back up to where you'd like it to be. I'm going to try sending the lead an octave up. You got to really play with octaves while you're working with these. That sounds good. So wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, the texture that we're getting is caused by the intermodulation that's happening when the two tones of the sub and the lead mix inside of the distortion. If you want to learn more about what intermodulation is and how it works and how distortions work, I highly recommend checking out this FabFilter Saturn tutorial by the incredible Dan Worrell, linked at the top of the video. But above and beyond saying, well, it's intermodulation, there's a second way to think about it. We can look at what's going on in the time domain. If we look at the waveform of our resulting combination into the distortion in an oscilloscope, we can get an idea of what's happening. For clarity's sake, I'm going to use a digital hard clipper rather than decapitator to make the effect more obvious visually. Oops, forgot to turn the threshold down so that it's actually clipping. And we just take a look at this waveform. So what are we seeing here? Well, firstly, this long, slow sine wavy pattern is the bass. That's the sine wave sub that we are playing. And these smaller sawtooth waves, that's the lead. We see that the sawtooth goes through many cycles for each cycle that the sine wave goes through. And that's because it's playing at a higher pitch. That makes sense. As the peaks of the bass's waveform come up, the sawtooths of the lead get pushed into the distortion. And when they do that, there's nowhere for it to go. It's a hard clipper. And so they get completely clipped off, and only the bottom half of them remains. So the audible effect of this is that the lead gets kind of quieter for this particular section of the waveform. And then as we move down into the zero crossing of the sub, we get full spectrum clicks and it's back to as loud as it can be. And then as we hit the trough, we again run into the clipper and the lead's going to get quieter again. You can think of this as turning down the lead when the sub is loud. That's kind of the effect that throwing it through a distortion has. And this creates gaps in the lead. And these gaps, you can almost kind of hear them when you actually listen to the thing. It's that kind of bubbly texture. And these gaps are what give the polybass its distinctive grittiness. There's more than one way to achieve this. A distortion is just one way. We'll talk about the other two ways later. So I'd like to draw your attention to one of the properties of this sound, and that is that the interval that you play between the bass and the lead matters a lot to the tone of the actual sound that you get. So if I play an A and an A, that sounds pretty good, but if I play an A and a B, yikes, that's pretty dissonant. So this dissonance tends to exist mostly in the low mids of whatever you've got. So kind of this area here. So what a lot of people will do is put a big notch filter here and just really kind of delete the low mids from the combined signal. But as you'll have noticed by now, when you do that, you kind of lose a lot of the warmth of the lead. This turns into a very harsh sound. That's not always ideal. I'd always been frustrated when I made patches like this and had to do this, and recently I discovered a workaround. I started by asking myself the question, what if we could have a distortion with a sidechain input? If we did, I'd be able to feed that input with both the lead and the bass, but apply it to just the subchannel, and then EQ that nasty distortion resonance away while just leaving the lead completely clean. I checked to see if any of my distortion plugins had a sidechain input, but realized that they didn't. I was just about to complain about this on social media when I realized my mistake. You don't need one. You can do it yourself using phase cancellation. If you're not totally sure what phase cancellation is, once again, I'm going to refer you to the excellent Dan Worrell with FabFilter. He's explained it in this video more clearly than I ever possibly could. Please do yourself a favor, check out the link. It's life-changing. So once again, for the sake of simple explanation, I'm going to use the hard clipper, and I'm also only just going to use the lead, just to make things a little bit easier to understand, a little bit less complicated while we get through what may be the most difficult part of this video. So in addition to routing the lead into the distortion, we also need to route the lead in parallel into an inverter. And the best way to get an inverter in FL Studio is just the lovely fruity stereo shaper. You can open it up and drag both the left volume and the right volume all the way down to -1, which is going to flip the polarity of the left channel and the right channel and have those be what it outputs. This allows us to phase cancel our dry signal. So what we can see here is if I connect the lead to the output and then I also feed it through the stereo shaper into the output, we actually get no sound. If I turn down the output of the stereo shaper slightly, we start to get some sound back. But the louder it gets, the quieter that gets, and that's because they're perfectly phase canceling each other. When the waveform of the lead is positive, the waveform of the inverted signal is negative and exactly proportional, and they just cancel right back out to 0. We get full silence. Now instead what we're going to do is we're going to route through the clipper and then route the dry signal through the inverter and route that to the output. So being very careful that our input gain and our output gain are set to 0 so that the output of the distortion will be nominally the same level as what's coming into it, aside from the changes made by the distortion. If I now play a note, we get a very interesting looking signal. So this is what I'll call the distortion delta. It's the changes that are being made to the waveform by the distortion. So if you can imagine, each time we have one of these little negative sawtooths, this is actually where the saw wave is moving up through the top of the threshold and getting clipped off. And so the distortion is applying a negative signal to flatten that off. And then what we have here is the opposite end, where the sawtooth is actually poking through the bottom of the threshold, and so it's applying a positive shape to flatten that off. So if I now combine the original dry, unprocessed signal to the output, we get our original clipped signal back again. Now this might seem like a lot of work to do absolutely nothing, but the beautiful thing here is that we now have 3 different signal paths representing different parts of the signal. And really, we're going to think of it instead as just 2 parts. So here's what we've got. We've got the distortion delta, which is the distorted signal, combined with the inverted signal, which gives us just the changes the distortion makes to the signal to do the distorting. And then we've got the dry signal. And we can process these 2 completely independently. For instance, I can load an EQ that affects just the distortion delta. So for instance, I can cut the low mids of this signal while leaving the highs alone. So hold on to your hat because this is about to look really complicated, but I promise it's not actually that complicated. We'll walk through it. So here we've got the lead and the bass each going to 3 different places: into the distortion, into the inverter, and dry out to the output. This is the same diagram that we had before, but we're just sending both of them to each place. So we've got our distorted signal being combined with the dry signal, and that's the combined dry signal, the bass and the lead together. Both of those canceling out, so now we've got just the changes that the distortion is making to both of these signals together, which we can then EQ before they go out to the master, and then the lead and the bass, which in combination with the distortion delta, give us back basically our distorted signal again. If I haven't made any changes in the EQ yet, you can hear we've basically got what we had a couple of minutes ago. But now I can EQ this. So this is how we get at processing just kind of the tone that we've added with the distortion, but leaving the lead and the bass completely separate. The EQ is only going on to this distortion delta, and so the dry signals get to pass through completely unaffected. And the beautiful thing about this is that now we have a polybass that sounds pretty clean no matter what notes you throw into it, but still has lovely warm low mids from the lead. So at this point, I bet you are just about as tired as I am of listening to a saw and a sine wave, so let's jazz things up a little bit. One thing that can sometimes be fun is, once again, leveraging some weird phase rotation technology to further shape our sound. We can add a brick wall high pass to the lead before we send it everywhere. And since that's changing the waveform, by changing kind of the phase coherence of the saw wave, it changes how the lead and the bass interact inside of the distortion, without and with. It kind of softens it a little bit, and if you play with this cutoff here, you can kind of find a sweet spot. Other than this one weird trick, it's pretty much anything goes. You're just sound designing like regular. Sync, vibrato, glide, all super popular choices for leads. You can add reverb or dimension expander on maybe even just the dry part of the signal. And as for the bass, you can adjust the shape using bending, distortion, synced enveloping, whatever you like. Use your creativity. At this point, I'm going to switch over to a project that I've been working on that uses a polybass and show you how one might sound in action. So as you can see, we've pretty much got the same thing going here. We've got a lead and a bass that are going into a distortion and an inverter, and also out to the output. But now we're using SerumFX. And using this, we can add some volume enveloping to the polybass after it's been combined, which sometimes can help that to sound a little bit more coherent. Let's take a listen. So obviously that's a lot. Let's step through it backwards from the beginning of where I started to post-process and run you through the different decisions that I made here. So firstly, SerumFX, without everything going on, just sounds like this. And if I don't envelope it, it sounds like this. Much more like what we're used to. I'm using a third voice output from the piano roll to send MIDI directly to the SerumFX, but you'll notice something kind of weird. I've had to offset all of these by quite a bit from the notes that they're actually enveloping. And the reason for that is a bug in FL Studio. MIDI messages that get sent to plugins that are downstream of plugins that introduce latency, for instance, a linear phase EQ that I might use to process my distortion delta, these MIDI messages are not properly plugin delay compensated. What this means is that the MIDI that you send to the plugin will appear to arrive early, When a plugin incurs processing latency, usually FL Studio detects that and automatically delays every other piece of audio in the project to line back up with it. But MIDI messages are not properly delayed, so they appear to arrive early. Make no mistake, they're actually arriving on time. They didn't time travel. It's just that since all the rest of the audio is delayed, it seems like it's coming early. Unfortunately, it seems like the best thing to do is just offset this, which is really horrible. I mean, that's a pretty awful workflow. But it's either that or just don't add any latency before your SerumFX, and sometimes I'm willing to go through the trouble. This time was one of them. Do note that if you don't have to deal with this because you're not using linear phase EQ here, you can just probably send the lead MIDI to the SerumFX and it'll work just as well. One thing that's fun to note is that I've mapped velocity to the rate of this LFO, which is being used to control the level of the signal coming into SerumFX, the Polybass. And what that means is when I use a higher velocity, the envelope goes more quickly, and when I use a lower velocity, it goes more slowly, so I can kind of tailor it to the length of the note that I've actually got, so that it both swells in and swells out in an appropriate time. As for the effects, I've got a little bit of dimension expanding going. A little bit of a short delay. Some chorusing. That's not really doing much. Phaser. Also really subtle. EQ. Some of these were changes that I made after applying other effects in the processing chain. The next thing I did was some multiband distortion in Saturn II. Exciting the high end, adding a little bit more beef to the sub. Then I did a trick that I often like to do with Polybasses, which is to soothe the high end really hard, and then boost it back up. I've also got some mid-side EQ here to tone down some of the low stereo sub that's happening because of the dimension expander in SerumFX. That sounds like this. I find that that generally creates a really nice kind of fuzzy tone that's aggressive but still kind of soft in a way. Next we've got Disperser. Not very much, but a little bit goes a long way. Just adds those kind of kissy transients on top of it by phase rotation magic. Don't ask me how Disperser works. And here's something that I'm pretty sure I added, even though it's here in the processing chain, I'm pretty sure this got added to this processing chain fairly early. Some multiband distortion to really just kind of squeeze everything together. This is sort of like an OTT that doesn't mess up your phase. So that really adds a lot. And really, this is just, kind of a medium to a long attack on each of these bands. The threshold is set fairly low, so it's digging into the signal, and I'm adjusting the threshold and the output gain until I'm kind of compressing down to about where I was, but adding a reasonable amount of gain in between the transients. Next, some EQ, just rolling off some of the high end to help it fit better with the drums that I've got in this project. By cutting the super highs but boosting the highs, it doesn't actually sound like I've done a whole lot up here, but this leaves room for drum transients to take over the super high end. Next, a second round of soothing and EQing. And finally, a little bit of clipping at the very, very end just to tighten up the waveform. And I'm sure that this delay makes a lot bigger of a difference once all of this processing's been added than without it. The compression really kind of brings that up out of nothing. The chorus and phaser, not so much. Frankly, they're not doing anything. I could leave these disabled and it wouldn't make any difference. With drums, and that's pretty much it. Hopefully by now you understand the principles and can start making your own polybasses. But there's one last thing that we have to cover. You might remember, I said there are other ways to create the gaps in the waveform that give the polybass its kind of gritty, bubbly character. Well, SerumFX is actually how you do that too. On to another project. So this mess sounds like this. So what's going on here? This doesn't look much like what we had before, so I'm going to break it down. The first thing is that we've got a sub here, and I'm using some enveloping on sync to give it a little bit of motion. That sounds like this. And that is being fed into SerumFX, into the audio input. Now you'll notice here we've actually activated oscillators. The SerumFX is our lead when we're using this second kind of polybass. And the way that this works is, rather than adding the gaps by distorting together with the sub, we're actually using the sub to create the gaps directly. When we send audio in to the noise oscillator of SerumFX, that audio can be used as a modulator. So I can assign the noise osc to, for instance, the filter cutoff, which is what I've done here. And so what this means is when the sub waveform is loud, the filter cutoff will be lowered for the lead, and it'll make it quieter because it's filtered out. And then when the sub reaches its trough of its waveform, the filter will be raised back to full, and the lead will be loud again. We can confirm that this is what's happening if we check out the waveform at the very end. So what we see here is that on kind of the rising slope of the sub, we've got a lot of high frequency content, and then on the falling slope of the sub, we don't have much. Now, I said it was going to be the peaks that were going to be high frequency content, the troughs that were going to be low frequency content. The reason that it's like this is because I've gone ahead and used Fruity Stereo Shaper. It has an all pass built in, and I've used that to phase shift the sub that we're actually combining later downstream with this lead, so that the high frequency content is protected near the zero crossings if we decide to distort later, which I did. To review, if the high frequency content were up here at the top, we would get kind of the traditional polybass effect, and it would get totally zapped out of here because it would push into the distortion, and then the distortion would cut off all of those high frequencies. But when it's down here near the zero crossings of the sub, because we've done this phase rotation, it gets preserved, even though we're distorting kind of the tops up here. Now you notice I'm not actually putting any of the sub into what's coming out of SerumFX. I've got the level all the way down. So it's just the sub is just being used as a modulator here. It's not being used for audio. It's getting routed in parallel to the stereo shaper, and that's getting added to the signal later in the chain. Just as easily as you could modulate filter cutoff, you could instead modulate just the level of the oscillator, and that's another way to add kind of gaps where it gets quieter. That sounds like this. It's kind of a cleaner, brighter sound. You can decide which you like better or use both. Anyway, if you've stuck around this long, you're a real trooper. Thanks for listening. I hope you found it interesting. If you enjoyed the content, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, both of which will help me grow. If you have any questions, complaints, or comments, feel free to leave them for me underneath the video. Until next time, have a good one.